The vultures circled lower, their shadows dancing across Margaret Hayes's motionless body. She lay crumpled on the dusty Montana trail, her weathered hand clutching her chest where her heart had finally betrayed her. But the birds wouldn't land. They couldn't. Between them and their prey stood a massive lioness, her golden eyes burning with an intelligence that defied nature's laws. She growled, low and warning, positioning herself over the elderly woman like a sentry. In her powerful jaws, she carried something that shouldn't exist in this wild place, a faded handkerchief, its edges worn soft by time, embroidered with the initials M.H. Young Ranger Samuel Winters froze at the trail's bend, his radio halfway to his lips. In 20 years of wildlife work, he'd never seen anything like this. A wild lion protecting a human, returning a keepsake. The lioness gently placed the handkerchief beside Margaret's limp fingers, then resumed her vigil. How did she know? Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Margaret Eleanor Hayes had come to Montana to disappear. At 71, the former pediatric ICU nurse carried grief like stones in her pockets, one for Michael, her 3-year-old son, who died of malaria 40 years ago during their medical mission in Ghana, and another for Tom, her husband of 45 years who'd passed 5 winters ago. The cabin sitting 2 miles from Glacier Ridge Wildlife Reserve had been Tom's dream retirement spot. Close enough to the animals he'd protected as a ranger, far enough from the world that had taken too much from them both. The reserve sprawled across 8,000 acres of pristine wilderness where mountain lions roamed free under federal protection. Tom had walked these trails for 30 years, knew every deer path, every water source, every den. Now Margaret walked them alone, her nearest neighbor 5 miles away, Grace Miller, a veterinarian who understood that some wounds needed distance to heal. That embroidered handkerchief, now clutched in a wild lion's jaw, held the weight of unspeakable loss. Margaret had sewn those initials herself when pregnant with Michael. The soft cotton had absorbed her baby's fevered tears in that clinic in Kumasi, been clutched in his tiny fingers when the fever finally won. Tom had carried it every day after, tucked in his ranger uniform pocket like a talisman against forgetting. When cancer took him, Margaret had inherited this burden of remembrance. Samuel Winters knew none of this history as he watched the impossible scene before him. At 28, the young ranger saw only protocol violations and danger. His supervisor, Roberto Bob Carson, ran the reserve with bureaucratic efficiency despite his underlying kindness. Bob would demand answers. The reserve had strict boundaries between human and wildlife boundaries this lioness had clearly crossed. What Sam didn't know, couldn't know, was that his own existence was tied to Margaret's story. 25 years ago, his mother Sarah had been 8 months pregnant when her car rolled on black ice. Margaret, returning from a night shift, had crawled through twisted metal to deliver him on that frozen roadside, keeping Sarah conscious with steady hands and steadier words until help arrived. Sarah lived just long enough to see her son graduate from ranger school. These invisible threads connected them, all the grieving woman, the young ranger, and now, impossibly, a wild lioness who stood guard with the fierce devotion of a mother. 15 years earlier, the storm had come without warning. Montana summers knew thunderstorms, but nothing like the biblical deluge that struck in July 2009. Margaret watched from her cabin window as the sky turned the color of old bruises, remembering Tom's voice. When the animals go quiet, pay attention. The reserve had fallen into an eerie silence that afternoon. Birds vanishing, deer retreating to deep timber. By nightfall, the rain fell in sheets so thick she couldn't see her porch railing. The old ranger station, abandoned since Tom's retirement, sat a quarter mile through the woods. She heard it first as a sound that didn't belong, not the crack of falling branches or the rush of water, but something alive, desperate, young. The keening cry cut through the storm's roar, pulling at something primal in her chest. Margaret pulled on Tom's old ranger jacket, the canvas still smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and pine sap, Her flashlight beam barely penetrated the downpour as she fought through the trail-turned river. The ranger station's roof had partially collapsed years ago, leaving a maze of broken timbers and rusted equipment. The sound grew stronger, pain and fear in equal measure. She found the cub in the storm drain behind the station, a prison of concrete and rushing water, maybe 4 months old, though she couldn't be certain. Mountain lion cubs were rare sightings. Tom had seen perhaps a dozen in 30 years. This one was trapped, its hind leg wedged between the grate and pipe, water rising steadily around its small body. The cub's snarls were fierce but weakening, golden eyes clouded with infection, pus crusting the corners. Margaret's hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from 40 years of pediatric emergencies. The cub tried to bite, but its reactions were sluggish, uncoordinated, blind. She realized with a start, the infection had progressed too far. She'd seen similar infections in children treatable with antibiotics, fatal without them. The ethical weight pressed down helping meant breaking federal law. The reserve's strict non-interference policy. Not helping meant watching this infant creature drown. The cub's labored breathing decided her. She wrapped Tom's jacket around her arms for protection and reached into the drain. The metal grate was old, rusted. 3 hard pulls and it gave way with a shriek. The cub tumbled into her arms, surprisingly light, burning with fever. Its weak attempt to claw her felt like nothing more than a sick child's restless thrashing. That first touch shattered something inside her. The cub's fevered body against her chest. The small heart hammering with terror. Suddenly she was back in Ghana. Michael's small form burning in her arms. The clinic's tin roof hammering with rain just like tonight. Her tears mixed with the storm as she bundled the cub deeper into Tom's jacket. The journey back to the cabin became a blur of mud and memory. The cub had stopped fighting, going limp with exhaustion. Margaret's medical mind cataloged symptoms: severe conjunctivitis, likely bacterial, maybe chlamydia common in wildcats, treatable with tetracycline. She had Tom's old veterinary supplies. He'd always kept basics for injured wildlife, though he'd never brought them home. Inside the cabin, under proper light, she saw the full extent. The cub was female, desperately malnourished beneath soaked fur. But something else made Margaret's breath catch. The fur around the cub's neck was matted with saliva, not her own. Adult saliva, mother's saliva. This cub had been groomed recently, perhaps within the last day. The mother was alive, somewhere in this storm, had lost her baby to the flood. Margaret's hands trembled as she prepared warm saline solution, cleaning the infected eyes with gauze, soft as clouds. The cub submitted to treatment with the exhausted trust of the desperately ill. As Margaret worked, she found herself humming the same lullaby she'd sung to Michael, the one her grandmother had sung to her. The cub's breathing steadied, tiny body relaxing for the first time. By dawn, the storm had passed. Margaret had converted Tom's old office into a makeshift recovery room, the cub sleeping on heating pads in a large dog crate she'd found in the barn. She stood at the window, watching the ravaged forest, knowing what she'd done was irreversible. But as she'd held that burning body through the night, administering antibiotics every 4 hours, she'd felt something she hadn't experienced since Michael died: purpose. Before the morning coffee finished brewing, she was setting up Tom's trail cameras around the property. If the mother was alive, if she was searching, Margaret would know. The countdown had begun. 3 nights after the storm, the trail camera captured something that made Margaret's coffee mug slip from her fingers. The infrared image was grainy but unmistakable: a full-grown lioness dragging herself through the forest understory, her left hind leg useless, hanging at an unnatural angle. In her jaws, she carried a freshly killed rabbit. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. Margaret cycled through the camera's memory card with shaking hands. There she was again the next night. 2:08 a.m., another rabbit. The night after. 2:23 a.m., what looked like a ground squirrel. The lioness would drag herself to a spot exactly 100 yards from Margaret's cabin, deposit the prey, and collapse there for hours before limping back into the darkness. She was trying to feed her cub. Margaret realized with stunning clarity, this broken creature was still hunting, still providing, still hoping her baby would come. The cub Margaret had privately started thinking of her as hope was improving daily. The antibiotics had cleared the worst of the infection, though vision remained limited. Hope had begun eating solid food, the venison Margaret carefully prepared. But she would stop mid-meal sometimes, nose lifted, nostrils flaring. She smelled her mother. She knew. That evening, Margaret formulated a plan that Tom would have called either brilliant or insane. Using his old wildlife handling gloves, she collected the rabbit the mother had left, dragged it closer 70 yards from the cabin. The next night, when the lioness returned, she found the previous night's offering moved, but something else too. A fresh deer haunch Margaret had gotten from Grace Miller. No questions asked. The lioness circled the meat suspiciously before taking both, retreating to her 100-yard marker. Night by night, Margaret moved the feeding spot closer. 90 yards, 80, 70. She began leaving Tom's worn flannel shirts along the trail, creating a scent bridge between wild and domestic spaces. The cub would rub against these shirts, leaving her smell, claiming them. Margaret would return them to the trail, now carrying both human and cub scent. On the 10th night, Margaret watched through the window as the lioness finally approached within 50 yards of the cabin. Hope was pressed against the wire crate, making soft chirping sounds Margaret had never heard before contact calls. Tom's old journals called them mother-child communication. The lioness answered with a low, rumbling purr that carried through the still night air. They couldn't see each other, couldn't touch, but they knew, both mothers in the darkness, calling to their young. The moment shattered with the roar of an engine. Margaret's blood froze as headlights swept across her driveway. The lioness vanished instantly, swallowed by shadow. A reserve vehicle, she recognized the official markings. At 11 p.m., this wasn't a social call. Samuel Winters stood at her door in full ranger uniform, his expression unreadable. Margaret had seen him around the reserve, knew he was one of the younger rangers, eager to prove himself. His flashlight beam swept past her to the office where Hope was hidden. "Mrs. Hayes," he said formally, though something flickered in his eyes. "We've had reports of unusual wildlife activity in this area. I need to conduct a property check." Margaret stepped aside, her mind racing. The cub was silent, but the medical supplies were visible, the trail cameras obvious. Sam walked through her living room, noting everything, the veterinary manual open on the table, the raw venison thawing in the kitchen, the muddy boots that had walked trails no civilian should know. "You know, harboring protected wildlife is a federal offense," Sam said quietly, not looking at her. "Minimum $10,000 fine, possible jail time." "I know," Margaret replied simply. She wouldn't lie, wouldn't insult his intelligence. Sam turned toward the office door. Margaret moved to block him, her hand steady despite her racing heart. "Before you go in there," she said, "I need to show you something." From the bookshelf, she retrieved a photo album, dusty with disuse. She opened it to a yellowed newspaper clipping from 25 years ago. The headline read, "Miracle on Highway 89, Nurse Delivers Baby in Crash Wreckage." The grainy photo showed a younger Margaret, blood on her clothes, holding a newborn while paramedics worked on a woman trapped in twisted metal. Sam's face went white. He took the album with trembling fingers, studying the photo of his mother, Sarah Winters, her face pale but alive, reaching for her baby for him. "She lived 3 more years," Margaret said softly. "Long enough to see you walk, talk, call her mama. The cancer took her, but she got those years. She got to love you." Sam sank into a chair. The album clutched against his chest. "She told me," he whispered, "before she died. Said an angel pulled me into the world. Said I owed my life to Margaret Hayes." He looked up, tears streaming. "I became a ranger because of the stories she told about that night. About the woman who wouldn't give up." From the office came a soft mew, Hope calling out. Perhaps sensing the tension, Sam stood slowly, walked to the door, opened it. The cub blinked at him with clouded eyes. Too weak to be truly wild, too wild to be a pet. He saw the medical supplies, the professional setup, the care evident in every detail. "Her mother's out there," Margaret said. "Injured. Still hunting for her baby. Coming every night." Sam pulled out his phone, scrolled through reports. 3 weeks ago, a lioness was hit by a car near mile marker 15. Driver didn't stop. We found blood. Figured she'd crawled off to die. He studied the cub. Lactating female. Would have had cubs this spring. He was silent for a long moment, then pulled out his official notebook. "I'm logging this visit as a routine check. No violations found." He tore out a page, wrote quickly. "Dr. Grace Miller's veterinary license number. She's authorized to treat wildlife under emergency protocols. I'll leave antibiotics and supplies in your barn twice weekly. Unmarked bag." "Sam, 6 weeks." He interrupted. "That's what it takes for a compound fracture to heal enough for weight bearing. You have 6 weeks before my supervisor does his quarterly inspection. The cub needs to be gone by then." He paused at the door, not looking back. "My mother would have done the same thing. She would have saved them both." After his taillights disappeared, Margaret stood in the darkness, listening. Soon enough, she heard the rustle of undergrowth, the painful drag of a wounded animal returning to her vigil. The lioness had waited for the danger to pass. But she'd come back. She always came back. Margaret opened the window just a crack, enough for sound to travel. From the office, Hope's chirping calls floated out into the night. The answering rumble was immediate, powerful, a mother's promise carried on the wind. Margaret left the window open and settled into Tom's old armchair. She'd keep watch tonight, a guardian between two worlds, holding space for a reunion that nature's law said shouldn't happen. But a mother's love demanded must. The clock on the mantel ticked past midnight. 42 days remained. Outside, the lioness had dragged herself closer than ever before, 40 yards now, and settled into the tall grass. Margaret could just make out the green reflection of her eyes in the darkness. Two mothers, keeping vigil, bound by loss and hope in equal measure. The first week blurred into routines Margaret hadn't followed since her pediatric nursing days. Every 4 hours, she checked Hope's eyes, applying antibiotic drops with the gentle efficiency that had once soothed terrified children. The cub had stopped fighting the treatments, seeming to understand these hands meant healing, not harm. Margaret found herself talking during these sessions, her voice filling the silence Tom had left behind. "Hold still, little one," she murmured, cradling Hope's head as she'd once held countless sick children. Just like the eye drops for pink eye. You'd think after 40 years, I'd forget the technique, but hands remember what hearts can't forget. On the 4th night, as Margaret finished the midnight treatment, Hope did something unexpected. A rumble started deep in the cub's chest, not a growl, but a purr. The sound was different from a house cat's, deeper, wilder, but unmistakably content. Margaret's hands stilled. She hadn't heard that sound since Michael's kitten, Buttons, had curled against her son's fevered body that last terrible night in Ghana, purring as if love could heal what medicine couldn't. The dam broke. 40 years of carefully controlled grief cracked open. Margaret sobbed into her hands while Hope pressed against the crate bars, purring louder, instinctively offering comfort she couldn't understand was needed. Through her tears, Margaret found herself speaking a name she hadn't said aloud since Tom's funeral. "Michael would have loved you," she whispered to the cub. "He was 3, just 3, and so brave. Even when the fever took his sight near the end, he'd reach out, feeling for my face. 'Mama here,' he'd ask, always making sure I was close." Hope's clouded eyes blinked slowly, and Margaret could swear the cub understood something fundamental had shifted. From that night forward, Margaret talked freely during their sessions. She told Hope about Michael's laugh, how he'd chase lizards in the African heat, how his last words had been "love you, Mama," whispered against that embroidered handkerchief. Outside, the mother lioness had established her own routine. Each night she arrived earlier, stayed later. The feeding spot had moved to 30 yards from the cabin. Margaret had created an elaborate scent trail using Tom's work shirts, unwashed and full of his lingering presence. She'd rub them on Hope during treatments, then leave them along the path. The lioness would investigate each shirt, learning her cub's new vocabulary of smells human, medicine, safety. By the 10th day, Margaret caught glimpses of the mother standing during daylight, testing weight on her injured leg. The healing was remarkable. Wild creatures had reserves of strength domestic animals rarely showed. Sam had been leaving supplies as promised: antibiotics, bandages, and surprisingly, fresh game. A note on the second delivery simply read, "From a grateful son." Week 3 brought a breakthrough. Margaret was changing Hope's bedding when the cub suddenly went rigid, pupils dilating. At first, Margaret feared a seizure, but then she realized Hope was tracking her movements. The cub's eyes followed Margaret's hand as she waved slowly back and forth. The infection had cleared enough to restore partial vision. "You can see me," Margaret breathed, kneeling to Hope's level. The cub studied her intently, as if memorizing this face that had been only warmth and voice for weeks. Then Hope did something that shattered Margaret completely. She reached one paw through the crate bars, touching Margaret's wet cheek with surprising gentleness, exactly as Michael used to do when she cried. That afternoon, Margaret introduced toys, an old ball of yarn from her knitting basket, feathers tied to string, things that would have delighted Michael. Hope attacked them with growing coordination, her movements shifting from clumsy batting to precise pounces. The similarity to Michael's play was so strong Margaret had to leave the room, standing on the porch gulping mountain air until her heart steadied. The third week brought an unexpected visitor. Grace Miller's truck rumbled up the drive at midday, when no one should be visiting. Margaret's panic lasted only until she saw Grace's knowing smile. "Sam Winters can't keep a secret from someone who delivered him," Grace said, carrying her veterinary bag. "Besides, I've been watching that lioness through my spotting scope. Magnificent creature. Broken legs healing well. But she could use supplements." Grace examined Hope with professional efficiency, declaring the recovery miraculous considering. She left proper medications, liquid vitamins, and something else understanding. "I lost my daughter," Grace said quietly as they stood on the porch. "Car accident, 10 years ago. She was 22. Sometimes the universe gives us chances to heal by healing others. Don't waste it." By week 4, their secret circle had grown. Bob Carson himself appeared one evening, supposedly investigating unusual wildlife patterns. He stood in Margaret's kitchen, watching through the window as the mother lioness fed 40 feet away. "My wife died of cancer last year," he said unexpectedly. 37 years together. The house echoes now. He turned to Margaret. "I'm scheduling the quarterly inspection for August 15th. That gives you 18 more days. The access road will be closed for maintenance August 14th. He paused at the door. "Some rules matter more than others, Mrs. Hayes." Week 5 transformed everything. Margaret had begun taking Hope outside for supervised sessions in the fenced garden. The cub needed to learn hunting basics: stalking, pouncing, the patient waiting that meant survival. Margaret found herself on hands and knees, demonstrating how to creep through grass, feeling slightly absurd until Hope perfectly mimicked her movements. "That's it," she encouraged, dragging a feather toy. "Low and slow. Tom always said mountain lions were patience made flesh." They were practicing these games when Margaret noticed movement at the forest edge. The mother lioness stood in full daylight, 50 yards away, watching intently. Hope had noticed too, her entire body quivering with recognition. The chirping calls began, back and forth, a conversation Margaret couldn't translate but deeply understood. That night, Margaret made a decision. She took the handkerchief from her nightstand, Michael's handkerchief, Tom's talisman, her last physical connection to them both. She walked to the feeding station, now only 30 yards from her porch. The mother lioness was already there, having learned to arrive at sunset. For the first time, they truly saw each other. The lioness's eyes held intelligence, wariness, and something else, recognition of Margaret's role in her cub's survival. Margaret moved slowly, deliberately, placing the handkerchief beside the evening's meal. She backed away, maintaining eye contact. The lioness approached cautiously, sniffed the cloth thoroughly. Margaret held her breath, waiting for it to be shredded, destroyed. Instead, the lioness picked it up with surprising gentleness, carried it 10 feet away, and set it down carefully before returning to eat. She understood its value. Somehow, she knew it mattered. Week 6 arrived too quickly. Hope had transformed from a dying infant to a vibrant young predator. Her eyes had fully cleared, revealing stunning amber irises. Her coat gleamed with health. Most importantly, her wild instincts had awakened. She stalked birds through the window, practiced her killing bite on toys, responded to her mother's calls with increasing urgency. Sam arrived Tuesday evening with sobering news. Inspections in 3 days. Bob can't delay longer without raising suspicions. Federal teams coming to endangered species check. Margaret nodded, having known this moment would come. That night, she opened Hope's crate door, letting the cub explore the entire cabin. Hope investigated everything, rubbing her scent on furniture, claiming this space that had saved her. Finally, she settled beside Margaret's chair, purring as Margaret stroked her fur. "Tomorrow, little one," Margaret whispered. "You go home tomorrow." She gave Hope her final medical examination, documenting perfect health in notes no one would ever see. Every vital sign spoke of successful rehabilitation. Margaret should have felt proud. Instead, she felt the approaching goodbye like a stone in her chest. The last night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She pulled Tom's sleeping bag from the closet, laid it beside Hope's crate. The cub seemed to understand something momentous was coming. She pressed against the bars, and Margaret slipped her fingers through, feeling the warm fur, the steady breathing, the wild heart beating strong. "You know what Tom used to say?" Margaret whispered in the darkness. "He said the hardest part of wildlife work wasn't the ones you couldn't save. It was releasing the ones you did. Because love wants to keep, but wisdom knows when to let go." Hope licked Margaret's fingers, then settled down, maintaining contact through the bars. Outside, the mother lioness kept her vigil. Closer than ever, 25 yards now. 3 heartbeats in the darkness, one wild, one healing, one learning to let go. Margaret dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check Hope was still there, still real. As dawn approached, she heard it, the mother's call. Different this time, not searching or mourning, but summoning, ready. She looked at Hope, whose eyes were fixed on the window. The cub's muscles tensed with recognition, with longing, with the pull of what she was meant to be. Tomorrow had become today. Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting after the night on the floor. She looked at the handkerchief, still where the mother had carefully placed it days ago, untouched and waiting. Then she looked at Hope, whose eyes held a wild light that no cabin could contain. "Your mother's calling," Margaret said softly. "And mothers always know when it's time." Dawn came reluctantly, the sky bruising purple to pink above the Montana peaks. Margaret had wrapped Hope in Tom's ranger jacket, the same canvas that had carried her from the storm drain 6 weeks ago. The cub was heavier now, stronger, her muscles tense with anticipation rather than fever. Margaret's hands trembled as she secured the cabin one last time, knowing that when she returned, it would echo with new emptiness. The walk to the forest edge felt both endless and too brief. Each step carried the weight of what was coming, necessary and terrible in equal measure. Hope's head swiveled constantly, taking in the vast world beyond the cabin's safety. Her nostrils flared with each breath, reading stories in the wind that Margaret could never understand. The morning air carried pine resin and dawn dampness, the earthy smell of deer trails, and something else, the wild musk of Hope's mother, closer than ever. Margaret had chosen the release site carefully, a small clearing where the meadow met the tree line, where 2 worlds touched without quite merging. Tom had proposed to her in this very spot 38 years ago, saying that some places on Earth felt like bridges between what was and what could be. Now it would bridge another gap between the mother Hope remembered and the one who'd saved her. As they reached the clearing, Hope began to struggle, not to escape but to see better. Margaret set her down gently, keeping one hand on the cub's back. Hope's entire body vibrated with tension, her eyes scanning the forest shadows. The chirping calls began, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Margaret's throat tightened. This was the same sound Michael had made when calling for her in his delirium, that universal cry of young for their mothers. The answer came from everywhere and nowhere. A low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself, then, like smoke solidifying. The mother lioness emerged from the tree line 50 yards away. She moved differently now, the limp nearly gone, her stride carrying the coiled power of an apex predator. But she stopped at the forest edge, her amber eyes locked not on her cub, but on Margaret. The standoff stretched taut as wire. Margaret understood she was being evaluated, judged by standards older than human civilization. The lioness had accepted food from her, learned her scent, even carefully preserved the handkerchief. But this was different. This was about trust at its most fundamental. Would this human return what was taken? Could she let go? Hope mewed plaintively, trying to move toward her mother. But Margaret kept a gentle hand on her back. Not yet. This had to happen right. Had to honor both the wild and the domestic forces that had saved this young life. Margaret reached into her pocket, pulled out the handkerchief. It was more than cloth now, it was Michael's last touch, Tom's daily remembrance, 6 weeks of tears shed over a dying cub who'd lived. The initials, M.H., had faded but remained visible, like love itself diminished by time but never erased. She kissed the handkerchief once, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized were falling. Then she placed it on the ground in front of Hope. The cub sniffed it curiously, perhaps recognizing the salt, the sorrow, the love soaked into its fibers. With the mysterious wisdom of wild things, Hope picked it up gently in her mouth, the way she'd learned to carry toys without destroying them. "Go on, little one," Margaret whispered, lifting her hand from Hope's back. "Go to your mother." Hope took 3 steps forward, then stopped, looking back at Margaret with those amber eyes that had once been clouded with infection and were now clear as mountain water. The moment stretched between them 6 weeks of medicine and midnight feedings, of learning to trust hands that could have harmed but only healed. Hope chirped once, a sound Margaret had learned meant contentment, safety, acknowledgement. Then the cub turned and ran. Not the clumsy gallop of weeks ago, but the fluid grace of her species, the handkerchief fluttering from her jaws like a banner of surrender and victory combined. She covered the 50 yards in seconds, crashing into her mother with an explosion of chirps and purrs and sounds Margaret had no names for. The mother lioness examined her cub with frantic intensity, sniffing, licking, checking every inch for harm or change. Hope submitted to this inspection, then began her own exploration, rubbing against her mother's legs, rediscovering the scent that meant home. The reunion was so raw, so purely emotional, that Margaret had to look away, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. When she looked back, the mother lioness had picked up the handkerchief where Hope had dropped it. Margaret expected her to discard it, maybe shred it in displaced aggression. Instead, the lioness looked directly at Margaret, the handkerchief hanging from her jaws like an offering or acknowledgement. Their eyes met across the distance, 2 mothers who had fought death for the right to love, who understood that sometimes love meant holding tight and sometimes it meant letting go. The lioness dipped her head once, a gesture so deliberately human that Margaret gasped. Then she turned, chirped a command to Hope, and began walking back toward the forest. Hope followed immediately, but at the tree line, she stopped. The cub looked back at Margaret one last time, and in that gaze was everything gratitude, recognition, farewell. Then the forest swallowed them both, leaving only swaying branches to mark their passage. Margaret stood frozen for a moment. Then her knees buckled. She fell to the dew-soaked grass, sobs tearing from her chest with violence that frightened her. This wasn't just grief for Hope, it was for Michael, for Tom, for every goodbye she'd never gotten to say properly. Michael had slipped away in delirium, not knowing his mother was there. Tom had died while she was getting coffee, alone in a sterile hospital room. But Hope had looked back. Hope had said goodbye. The sun climbed higher, warming Margaret's face, but she couldn't move. She lay in the grass where she'd released Hope, arms wrapped around herself, Tom's jacket still smelling of mountain lion and medicine and miracle. The sobs gradually quieted to whispers, fragments of memory and prayer. "I did it, Tom," she gasped to the sky. "I let her go. I let her be wild." Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith, began its western descent. Margaret knew she should move, should return to the cabin. But her body wouldn't cooperate. She'd given everything to saving Hope, and now, with the cub gone, she felt emptied out, purposeless. The meadow grass whispered around her, and she closed her eyes, not sleeping but not quite conscious, floating in a space between loss and peace. A hand on her shoulder brought her back. Sam Winters knelt beside her, his ranger uniform dusty from what must have been a long search. His face carried concern but also understanding. He'd seen the empty cabin, the open crate, had pieced together what happened. "Mrs. Hayes," he said gently. "Margaret, let me help you up." She looked at him through swollen eyes. "She went back to the wild. Sam, I kept my promise." "I know," he said, helping her sit up. "I saw the tracks. 2 sets, walking together into the forest. You did the right thing." Margaret laughed. A broken sound. "It doesn't feel right. It feels like my heart's been torn out." Again. Sam sat down beside her, this young man whose life she'd helped begin. "My mother used to tell me about the night you saved us. She said you fought death itself to bring me into the world. Said you wouldn't let go even when the paramedics arrived. Kept holding her hand, promising her she'd see her baby grow." He paused, looking toward the forest. "She said you told her something that night, when she was crying about maybe not living to see me grow up. Do you remember?" Margaret shook her head, those hours a blur of blood and urgency. "You told her that love doesn't end when we let go. That every goodbye carries a piece of hello. Every ending holds a beginning. That the love we give returns to us in ways we never expect." Sam helped her to her feet, steadying her. "You were right then. You're right now." Margaret leaned against him. This son she'd delivered who'd become the protector of wild things. "I got to say goodbye this time," she whispered. And somehow that made all the difference. With Michael, with Tom, I never got to say goodbye. They just left. But Hope looked back. She saw me. She knew she was loved. Sam drove her back to the cabin in respectful silence. As they pulled up, Margaret noticed something on the porch, a tuft of tawny fur caught on the railing where Hope used to rub. She retrieved it carefully, holding it up to the late afternoon light. It was soft as silk, carrying the faint scent of wild places and second chances. That night, Margaret sat in Tom's chair, the tuft of fur in one hand, a photo of Michael in the other. The cabin did echo with new emptiness, but also with something else, completeness. For 6 weeks, she'd been a mother again. For 6 weeks, she'd fought death and won. And at the end, she'd done what she couldn't do for Michael, what she'd been denied with Tom. She'd said goodbye with love instead of desperation, with open hands instead of clinging fists. Outside, the moon rose full and bright. Somewhere in that silver-washed wilderness, a mother lioness was teaching her cub to hunt, carrying an old handkerchief in her den, guarding a symbol of the bridge between wild and tame, and in her cabin, Margaret Hayes finally understood what Tom had tried to tell her before he died, that love wasn't measured in how tightly we hold on, but in how bravely we let go. She stood, walked to the window, placed her hand on the glass. "Thank you, Hope," she whispered to the night. "Thank you for letting me say goodbye." A distant roar answered, so faint it might have been wind or imagination. But Margaret knew better. She'd learned to speak the language of mothers, regardless of species. It was a language that needed no words, only the fierce, terrible, beautiful willingness to love more than loss, to choose hello even knowing goodbye would come. The roar came again, closer this time, and Margaret smiled through her tears. They were out there, alive and wild and free, and that was enough. 5 years had carved deeper lines into Margaret's face, but her eyes remained sharp as she scanned the ridgeline through Tom's old binoculars. At 76, her mornings began the same way: coffee, heart medication that she often forgot to take, and this vigil at the window. She was searching for a particular silhouette, one she'd know anywhere. Hope was out there, had been spotted monthly by various hikers, now a legend among the reserve staff. The lioness who knew humans, who carried something in her den, who had 3 cubs trailing behind her like golden shadows. "You should see them, Mrs. Hayes," Sam had told her last week, his own face showing the years, early silver threading through his hair at 33. 3 females, about 2 years old, strong as their mother. One has this white patch on her ear, looks like a star. Margaret lived for these reports, these glimpses of the life Hope had built. Her own life had narrowed to this cabin, these windows, this watching. Doctor Grace Miller checked on her weekly, frowning at her blood pressure, the irregular heartbeat that Margaret waved away as unimportant. "You need to consider moving to town," Grace said for the 100th time. "Closer to the hospital. This isolation isn't healthy." But Margaret couldn't explain that the isolation was the point. Here, she could feel Tom in every creaking board. Here, she could walk to the clearing where she'd released Hope, though the walk took 40 minutes now instead of 15. Here, she could pretend that the rustling in the night was Hope checking on her, returning the favor of all those midnight medicine doses. She'd seen Hope directly only 3 times in 5 years. Once, at dawn, the lioness had stood at the tree line with a fresh kill, teaching her cubs to feed. She'd looked up, directly at Margaret's window, holding the gaze for a long moment before melting back into the forest. The second time, during a November snowstorm, Margaret had glimpsed 4 shapes crossing the meadow Hope and her daughters, heading to lower ground. The third time had been last month, and it had shaken Margaret to her core. She'd been sitting on the porch, too tired to stand after checking the mailbox, when Hope had emerged alone from the forest. The lioness was fuller now, her coat thick with maturity, but Margaret knew her instantly. Hope had walked to within 30 feet of the porch, closer than she'd been since her release, and sat down, just watching. In her mouth, impossible but true, was a weathered piece of fabric, the handkerchief, or what remained of it. They'd sat together for an hour, 2 mothers in the afternoon sun, neither moving, neither needing to. Then Hope had stood, dropped the cloth fragment carefully on a rock, and vanished. Margaret had retrieved it with shaking hands, just a corner really, the embroidered M barely visible. Hope had kept it all these years, had brought it back to show Margaret she remembered. Now, 10 years after that summer of salvation, Margaret was 81 and fighting a body that had decided to quit. The heart medication sat unopened more often than not. The pills made her dizzy, clouded her mind, and she needed clarity for her watching. Sam had installed an emergency button, but she'd never used it. What was the point of prolonging what was already extended past its purpose? This morning, May 15th, 2024, had brought disturbing news. Hikers had reported an injured lioness near Michael's Rock, Margaret's private name for the granite outcrop where she used to take Hope during those healing weeks, telling the cub stories about her son while practicing walking exercises. The description matched Hope, mature female, unusual comfort around humans, something white clutched in her mouth. Margaret's heart, already unreliable, stuttered at the thought of Hope injured. She stood. Decision made before reason could interfere. The trail to Michael's Rock was 3 miles, rough terrain that she hadn't attempted in 2 years. But Hope needed her. That was all that mattered. She left a note on the table habit from living alone, took her walking stick and a water bottle, and set off. The morning was crisp, perfect hiking weather for someone whose joints didn't scream with every step. The first mile went well enough, muscle memory carrying her along paths worn by 30 years of walking. But at the meadow, the chest pain started. It was different from her usual discomfort, sharper, radiating down her left arm. Margaret stopped, leaning against a pine, waiting for it to pass. The water bottle shook as she drank, and she realized her hands were going numb. The smart thing would be to turn back. The smart thing would be to use the emergency whistle Sam had forced her to carry. Instead, she pushed on. Michael's Rock was just ahead, maybe half a mile. She could make it. She had to make it. Hope had come to her when Margaret could help. Now, Margaret would go to Hope. The trail blurred. Whether from tears or failing vision, she couldn't tell. Each step became monumental, requiring complete concentration. The walking stick slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering on stones. Margaret continued without it, one hand pressed to her chest, the other reaching for tree trunks, boulders, anything to pull herself forward. She saw Michael's Rock through the trees, that familiar granite face where she'd spent so many hours. Just a little farther, just a few more steps. The pain exploded then, not sharp, but crushing, as if the mountain itself had decided to sit on her chest. Margaret's knees buckled, and she fell hard, her cheeks scraping against rough stone. She managed to roll onto her back, staring up at the canopy, pine branches making a lattice against the noon sun. Her left arm was completely numb now, her breathing shallow, insufficient. This was it, then. This was how she'd joined Tom and Michael, alone on a mountain trail, chasing ghosts and mountain lions. "I'm coming, Michael," she whispered, or tried to. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. "Mama's coming, baby." The world began to fade, edges going dark. But through the encroaching tunnel, she saw them vultures, circling lower, patient as death itself. She wanted to wave them off, to protest this indignity, but her arms wouldn't respond. The darkness was winning, pulling her down, and Margaret Hayes surrendered to it. Her last coherent thought a prayer that someone would find her before the scavengers did their work. She didn't hear the roar that scattered the vultures. She didn't see the tawny form that burst from the undergrowth, moving with deadly purpose toward the birds that dared approach. She didn't feel the warm breath on her face as her hope stood over her, lips pulled back in a snarl that promised death to anything that came close. Sam Winters was doing his routine afternoon patrol when he saw the vultures scatter, unusual for midday unless disturbed. He turned his ATV toward Michael's Rock, knowing Margaret sometimes walked there despite his warnings. As he crested the ridge, he stopped so abruptly he nearly flipped the vehicle. The scene before him defied every protocol, every training manual, every piece of wisdom about wildlife behavior he'd accumulated in 15 years. Margaret lay motionless on the trail, her face gray, lips blue. But she wasn't alone. A massive lioness stood over her, and Sam recognized Hope instantly, the same eyes that had watched him leave supplies all those years ago, now fierce with protective rage. But Hope wasn't alone either. 3 younger lionesses, Hope's daughters, had formed a perimeter around Margaret's body. They faced outward, a living shield against the vultures that hopped at a safe distance, waiting for the cats to leave. One of the young lionesses, the one with the white starred ear, was making a sound Sam had never heard from a mountain lion. A low, continuous rumble that sounded almost like calling. Sam reached for his radio, then stopped. Any sudden movement might trigger an attack, not on him but in startled defense. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible. Hope watched him approach, her tail twitching with agitation. But she didn't growl. When he was 10 feet away, she did something extraordinary. She looked from him to Margaret, then stepped back. Just one step. But the meaning was clear. Help her. Sam dropped to his knees beside Margaret, his fingers finding her throat, searching for a pulse. There faint, irregular. But there. She was alive. The warmth of Hope's body had kept her from going into deeper shock. He realized the lioness had been lying against Margaret, sharing heat, probably for an hour or more based on the disturbed ground. Medical emergency at Michael's Rock, Sam said into his radio, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Send the helicopter. Cardiac event. Patient unconscious but alive. And... He paused, looking at the 4 lionesses still standing guard. Tell them to approach carefully. We have a situation. As the radio crackled with responses, Hope moved closer again. From somewhere, Sam couldn't see where she produced a scrap of fabric. The handkerchief. Or what remained of it after 10 years. She placed it gently on Margaret's chest, then lay down beside her, pressing against Margaret's side, sharing warmth, sharing strength, sharing the fierce determination to keep death at bay. The younger lionesses maintained their perimeter, and Sam realized with stunning clarity that they'd been taught this. Hope had somehow taught her daughters about Margaret, about the debt owed, about the human who deserved protection. The one with the starred ear kept up that rumbling call, and Sam understood now she was calling for help the only way she knew how, hoping someone, anyone, would hear and come. The helicopter appeared 15 minutes later, the sound scattering the younger cats into the forest. But Hope remained, pressed against Margaret, even as the paramedics approached with their equipment and stretchers. Only when they began to lift Margaret did Hope finally retreat, backing away slowly, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. As they loaded Margaret into the helicopter, Sam saw Hope do something that would haunt him forever. The lioness stood on her hind legs, reaching toward the helicopter with one paw, exactly as he'd seen his neighbor's house cat do when wanting to be picked up. It was a gesture so human, so full of desperate wanting, that Sam had to turn away. The helicopter lifted off, and Hope roared not a hunting roar or a territorial claim, but something else entirely. It sounded like grief. It sounded like love. It sounded like goodbye. Sam Winters couldn't stop staring at the scrap of weathered fabric in the evidence bag. 3 days had passed since the helicopter lifted Margaret from Michael's Rock, and he'd returned to the scene to investigate, to understand what he'd witnessed. The handkerchief piece Hope had placed on Margaret's chest lay exactly where the paramedics had set it aside, forgotten in the urgency of saving a life. Now, under the fluorescent lights of the ranger station, Sam examined it with growing amazement. The fabric should have disintegrated years ago. Mountain lions didn't carefully preserve human artifacts. They marked territory with urine, cached kills under dirt and leaves, lived lives governed by instinct and survival. But this cloth had been maintained, protected. The edges weren't torn by teeth but worn smooth by handling. The embroidered M was faded but intact, as if it had been kept somewhere dry, safe from the elements. "That's impossible," Grace Miller said, looking over his shoulder. She'd driven down from her clinic after hearing about Margaret's collapse. "Lions don't do this." "Nothing about this follows protocol," Sam muttered, pulling up his laptop. "I need to check something." For the past 2 years, Sam had been installing motion-activated cameras throughout the reserve, part of a wildlife monitoring program. He'd never thought to check the ones near Margaret's cabin. There'd been no reason to. Now, he pulled up the archived footage, starting from a month ago and working backward. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between wild and domestic. The first relevant clip was from 3 weeks ago. 2:47 a.m. Hope appeared at the edge of Margaret's property, but she wasn't alone. Her 3 daughters followed, and Hope was clearly teaching them something. She approached Margaret's porch, made a specific chirping sound, then retreated. Each daughter repeated the action approach: chirp, retreat. They were practicing. Hope was teaching them to announce themselves to Margaret. Sam scrolled further back. 2 months ago. January footage despite the snow. Hope alone this time, carrying something in her mouth. She approached Margaret's bedroom window, stood on hind legs, and placed something on the windowsill, a pine cone. The camera angle showed Margaret inside, asleep, unaware of the gift left in the night. 6 months ago. Hope again, this time during Margaret's birthday based on the date stamp. 4 lionesses at the tree line at sunset, sitting in plain view of the cabin for exactly 1 hour, the length of Margaret's birthday dinner with Grace, recorded by the doorbell camera. They'd been present for her celebration, watching over her. My God, Grace breathed. She's been checking on Margaret all along. But the real revelation came when Sam accessed the oldest archived footage from cameras Tom Hayes had installed 15 years ago that still functioned on the reserve's backup system. Sam had discovered them doing maintenance last year but never reviewed the ancient recordings. Now, with shaking fingers, he pulled up files from 1994. The grainy footage showed a younger Tom Hayes, robust and confident in his ranger uniform, kneeling beside an injured lioness. The animal was badly wounded, caught in a poacher's snare that had nearly severed her front leg. Tom worked carefully to free her, talking constantly in the same soothing voice Margaret had used with Hope. The lioness was heavily pregnant, sides distended with cubs close to birth. Sam fast-forwarded through hours of Tom treating the wound, returning daily with antibiotics he'd clearly stolen from the reserve's veterinary supplies. 2 weeks later, the footage showed the lioness with 3 newborn cubs, one notably larger than the others, a female with distinctive ear markings that would have been Hope's mother. 3 generations, Sam said quietly. Tom saved Hope's grandmother, Margaret saved Hope, and now Hope. His phone rang. The hospital. Mr. Winters, this is Dr. Patterson. You're listed as Margaret Hayes's emergency contact. I need to discuss something unusual about her case. Sam drove to Kalispell Regional Medical Center in record time, his mind spinning with the implications of what he'd discovered. He found Dr. Patterson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a puzzled expression. Mrs. Hayes is stable, she said immediately. But she shouldn't be. When she arrived, her core temperature was 94 degrees, not low enough for the hypothermia that might have protected her organs, but not high enough for normal function. She should have experienced catastrophic organ failure after lying exposed for over an hour post-cardiac event. She pulled up thermal imaging from the helicopter's emergency equipment. Look at this. These heat signatures around her body, they're not human. Too large, wrong distribution. Something was keeping her warm. The paramedics mentioned lions, but that's not impossible. Sam finished. Doctor, what saved her? The maintained body temperature. Her heart stopped for at least 4 minutes based on the enzyme levels, but her brain received just enough oxygen because she didn't go into deep hypothermia. Something or someone kept her at exactly the right temperature to prevent death but allow recovery. It's like... She paused, struggling for words. Like something understood precisely how to keep her alive. Sam thought of Hope pressed against Margaret, of the 3 younger lionesses forming a windbreak, of the starred-eared daughter calling for help. Can I see her? Margaret was awake, though barely. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines, but her eyes were clear when they found Sam's face. Hope, she whispered. She saved you, Sam said simply. Her and her daughters. They stood guard for over an hour, kept you warm, called for help. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The handkerchief. Sam pulled the evidence bag from his pocket. She kept it. Margaret, 15 years, and she kept it safe. Look. He held it up to the light. See these marks? They're from cleaning. She groomed it, kept it preserved. Mountain lions don't do that. They don't save keepsakes. But Hope did. For you. Margaret reached out with trembling fingers. touching the bag. "Tom's journal," she said suddenly. "In the cabin. His 1994 journal. Read it." Sam found the journal that evening, leather-bound and water-stained. Tom's careful handwriting documented the rescue of the pregnant lioness, but the final entry about her was what stopped Sam's breath. "Released her today, after 3 weeks of treatment. She's healed well. Cub's thriving. Strange thing, she took the gauze I'd been using to clean her wound. Carried it away in her mouth, gentle as a house cat with a toy. I know it's anthropomorphizing, but I swear she understood what I'd done. Saved her life, saved her cubs. There was intelligence in those eyes, maybe even gratitude. If animals can love, can they also remember? Can they pass down stories of kindness the way we pass down stories of fear? I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that someday, somewhere down the line, this kindness might circle back. The universe has a way of balancing things." Sam closed the journal, understanding flooding through him. Hope wasn't just returning a single favor. She was completing a circle Tom had started 30 years ago. The handkerchief wasn't just a keepsake, it was a promise, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. A tangible reminder that some debts transcend species. Back at the hospital the next morning, Sam found Margaret sitting up, color returning to her cheeks. Dr. Patterson had called it miraculous, but Sam knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was the inevitable return of love given freely, the universe balancing its books through the memory of mountain lions. "I brought you something," Sam said, pulling up videos on his tablet. "You need to see this." He showed her everything: Hope's midnight visits, the birthday vigils, the careful preservation of the handkerchief, Tom's rescue of Hope's grandmother. Margaret watched in silence, tears streaming down her face, seeing the full picture of a love story that spanned 3 decades and 3 generations. "She never forgot," Margaret whispered. "None of them ever forgot." "The reserve board is meeting tomorrow," Sam said. "Bob Carson is proposing something unprecedented, a protected status for Hope's lineage, permanent designation of 500 acres including your cabin and Michael's Rock. They're calling it the Hayes Wildlife Covenant. No hunting, no interference, just protection, forever." Margaret looked out the window toward the mountains. "Tom always said conservation wasn't about saving animals. It was about saving the connections between us, the threads that remind us we're all part of something bigger." She turned to Sam. "When can I go home?" "The doctors say a week, maybe 2. Margaret shook her head. "Hope's waiting. She needs to know I'm alive, that I'm coming back." That afternoon, Sam drove to the tree line near Margaret's cabin with a pair of binoculars and Tom's old ranger shirt from Margaret's closet. He hung it on a branch where Hope would find it, where the scent would tell her Margaret survived. As he turned to leave, he heard it a chirp from the forest, then another, then a third. They were there, watching, waiting. The guardians of Margaret Hayes, keeping vigil as she had once kept vigil over one of them. The circle was complete, but not closed. It would continue, spiraling forward through time, a testament to the truth Tom had discovered and Margaret had proven: love, real love, transcends everything, even species, even death, even time itself. The reserve board meeting lasted 3 hours, but Bob Carson needed only 3 minutes to make his case. He played Sam's footage on the conference room screen, Hope standing guard over Margaret, her daughters forming their protective circle, the years of midnight vigils at the cabin. When the lights came back on, there wasn't a dry eye among the 12 board members. "I propose we establish the Hayes Wildlife Covenant," Bob said, his voice steady despite his emotion. 500 acres encompassing Mrs. Hayes's property, Michael's Rock, and the traditional territory of this lioness pride. Full protection in perpetuity. And I further propose we name Margaret Hayes as Wildlife Guardian Emeritus, with lifetime residence rights and a stipend for her service to conservation. The vote was unanimous. 2 weeks later, Margaret returned home in Sam's truck, a portable oxygen tank at her feet and nitroglycerin tablets in her pocket. Dr. Patterson had wanted her in assisted living, but Margaret had refused with such vehemence that the doctor had finally relented, arranging for daily nurse visits instead. As they pulled up to the cabin, Margaret gripped Sam's arm. Look! At the forest edge, exactly where Margaret had released her 15 years ago, sat Hope. The lioness was grayer now, her face showing her years, but her posture remained regal. Beside her, 3 younger lionesses watched the truck with intelligent eyes. Margaret stepped out slowly, Sam hovering anxiously. She walked to her porch chair, Tom's old chair, and sat down heavily. Hope rose, stretched, and walked forward. Not charging, not stalking, just walking. She stopped 30 feet away and lay down, sphinx-like, her eyes on Margaret's face. "Hello, my dear one," Margaret whispered. Hope's ear twitched acknowledgement. They sat together in the morning sun, 2 old mothers who'd fought death and won, who'd learned that love was bigger than fear, stronger than instinct, more enduring than grief. This became their ritual. Every morning, Margaret would take her coffee to the porch. Hope would emerge from the forest, sometimes alone, sometimes with her daughters, and they would simply exist together. No interaction needed, just presence. The nurses learned to work around it, though they never quite stopped marveling. 6 months later, Sam brought someone special to meet Margaret. His wife carried a bundle of pink blankets, their daughter born just 2 weeks before. "Her name is Hope Margaret Winters," Sam said, placing the infant in Margaret's arms. "We wanted her to know the woman who brought me into the world, who taught me that kindness creates circles that never end." Margaret cradled the baby, tears falling freely. Through the window, she saw Hope watching from her usual spot, and for a moment, their eyes met 2 mothers, 2 species, one understanding. Sam had framed the handkerchief remnant in museum-quality glass, hanging it in Margaret's living room. Beneath it, he'd arranged 3 photographs, Tom with the rescued grandmother lioness in 1994, Margaret releasing Hope in 2009, and a new one, all 4 lionesses at the forest edge, taken just yesterday. 3 generations of humans, 3 generations of lions, bound by choices made from love rather than logic. 5 years passed in peaceful rhythm. Margaret grew frailer but never lost her morning ritual. Hope's muzzle went white, her movements slower, but she never missed a day. The younger lionesses had cubs of their own now, and sometimes the entire pride would appear. 7 lions strong, keeping watch over the cabin. On Margaret's 90th birthday, the entire town gathered at the Reserve Center for the dedication of the Hayes Wildlife Education Center. Margaret attended in a wheelchair, oxygen tubes discreet beneath her nose. As Bob Carson spoke about legacy and conservation, a murmur ran through the crowd. On the ridge above the center, silhouetted against the sunset, stood Hope with her daughters and granddaughters. 4 generations now, all watching the celebration below. Margaret struggled to her feet, Sam rushing to steady her. She pulled Tom's old ranger hat from her bag, she'd kept it all these years, and waved it slowly above her head. Hope stood on her hind legs, just for a moment, and roared. Not a threat or warning, but something else: acknowledgement, celebration, farewell. Gratitude, all of it and none of it. Because human language had no words for what passed between species when love made them family. "Love doesn't end at species lines," Margaret said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It doesn't end at all. Michael taught me that. Hope proved it. And Tom knew it all along." As the sun set behind the mountains, the handkerchief in its frame caught the last light, the embroidered initials still visible: M.H. Michael Hayes, Margaret Hayes, and now, Margaret's Hope. 3 names, 3 souls, one endless circle of love returning to itself, over and over, forever. I've told you this story because I need you to understand something I learned too late. Family isn't built from blood alone, and gratitude doesn't always speak our language. Margaret Hayes taught me that the night she pulled me from my mother's womb on that frozen highway. I became a ranger thinking I'd protect wildlife, but really, I was completing a circle she started with her own shattered heart. When we love without conditions, without boundaries, that love writes itself into the world's memory. Tom knew it when he saved Hope's grandmother. Margaret proved it when she chose healing over law. Hope confirmed it when she stood guard over the woman who'd returned her to the wild. 3 generations teaching the same truth: what we give with open hands returns to us when we need it most. I watch my daughter now, Hope Margaret, playing in the meadow where her namesake still roams. She waves at shadows in the forest, and sometimes, I swear they wave back. This is our inheritance, not property or money, but the understanding that every act of mercy echoes forward through time, creating family from strangers, guardians from wild things, and love from what seemed lost forever.